Hello and welcome. His views on and support for Charles Darwin's theories have put him at odds with the religious establishment, but he relishes the battle as he debates evolution over creation. This week on One, meet the British biological theorist and best-selling author, Professor Richard Dawkins. Born into what was then the colony of Nairobi, Kenya, his early years were spent surrounded by the incredible diversity of African life. But Richard Dawkins' family was essentially a middle-class British one, serving its country in a colonial setting. It was only as he became a little older that Dawkins began to really explore the details of evolutionary evidence and question the foundations of organized religion. His first best-selling book in 1976, The Selfish Gene, started a wave of debate on the potential of human genetics that made him a controversial but highly respected figure promoting the theories of the evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin. Dawkins went on to stamp his authority in the field 30 years later with The God Delusion, generating more controversy but stirring more debate, and followed up shortly after with The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution, in 2009. Throughout the years, the charismatic and die-hard scientist has remained determined to make sure the debate on where and how we came to be is not simply left to the teachings of religious scholars. Richard Dawkins, absolute delight to speak with you.
Thank you.
Now, so often you're called Darwin's Rottweiler or Darwin's child, a slightly gentler epithet, I guess. How do you feel about that kind of association of your name with the Darwin name all the time? I know you obviously are very much a fan of the Darwin's ideas and so on, but how do you like that kind of title?
Obviously, I'd rather be associated with Darwin's name than a Rottweiler's name, although actually Rottweilers are very charming, sweet dogs when you get to know them. The Rottweiler, I suppose, is meant to suggest aggression. I'm not a very aggressive person, really. I, of course, have an enormous regard for Darwin. I think he's one of the greatest scientists ever. And so, obviously, I feel humble but delighted to have any sort of association with him.
Of course, you're one of the most widely published atheists and certainly a very prolific writer on the subject. When you do promote the ideas so publicly, what is it you're trying to achieve?
Truth, really. I feel passionately about what's true, partly because it's so exciting. I mean, the truth of existence, of what the world is like, what the universe is like, what life is like, how life comes into being, all that is so utterly intriguing that I really want to infect other people with my own enthusiasm for it.
I was interested to read that you once described yourself as a cultural Christian, and were even suggesting a slogan, atheist for Jesus.
Atheist for Jesus, yes, that's right.
What is a cultural Christian?
Well, I mean, I have an affection for village cricket matches and pubs and that kind of thing, and I think that sort of mild Church of England Christianity, where nobody really believes it or doesn't take it very seriously, does kind of appeal to me. As so many of my Jewish friends call themselves cultural Jews, but are actually atheists, and so I guess it's a similar thing.
So do people who have strong religious views and particularly vocal with them, do they bother you? Do they frustrate you?
Well, they frustrate me when they interfere with scientific truth. I mean, when they try to miseducate people and try to persuade children that the world is less than 10,000 years old, that kind of thing. I mean, that's actually, I think, rather wicked, because the truth is so exciting that to mislead children like that is bad.
How do you regard the concept of spirituality then, as opposed to ritualistic religion or organized religion?
Well, spirituality can mean something that I'm very sympathetic to, which is a sort of sense of wonder at the beauty of the universe, the complexity of life, the magnitude of space, the magnitude of geological time. All those things create a sort of frisson in the breast, which you could call spirituality, but I would be very concerned that it shouldn't be confused with supernaturalism.
Now, you're a best-selling author, you're widely read, but do you ever worry about offending people? Is it something that does concern you?
I don't want to offend people, but I don't think that people have a right to be immune to being offended just because they're religious. I don't want to offend somebody by saying they've got an ugly face, and I wouldn't do that. But when it's a matter of disagreement about something important, like the origin of the universe, the origin of life, that sort of thing, I don't think people should be offended just by mere disagreement.
Now, I want to take you back. You were born in Nairobi, a colony of Kenya at the time, in 1941. Africa was a very different place. What do you recall of those early years?
Hugely different. I mean, it was paternalistic. I was brought up in a family with lots of servants, and it was a very, very different place indeed. It was a benevolent sort of paternalism does sort of convey that. It wasn't tyrannical, but it was certainly patronizing.
Now, you moved as a toddler from Nairobi to Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, of course, yeah.
Yes.
And again, as you were growing up, what were the things that occupied you as a child?
I played around like any other child. I wasn't much of a naturalist. I sort of Africa in a way was wasted on me. I chased butterflies and I had a pretty happy childhood at that time.
I know I've read that you say the landscape still haunts you from that time, the African landscape, and I wonder what that sort of exposure to that kind of environment did in terms of influencing your approach to biology.
Not a great deal, I suspect. I mean, I've been back to Africa several times as an adult, and I think that's where I've really been moved by it. I don't think it probably had that much of an impression on me as a child. And maybe since we're all originally from Africa, and our ancestry came from Africa, maybe we all have a sort of atavistic affection for the African landscape.
Your father, Clinton John Dawkins, was in the British Civil Colonial Service and was actually drafted into the military, wasn't he?
In about 1940, it must have been, he was called up and went to the army in Kenya. My mother was not supposed to go with him. The wives were all supposed to stay behind, but she managed to smuggle herself in to Kenya. They drove up in an old car and had some wonderful adventures on the way up, entered Kenya illegally, and she stayed with him all the time. It's kind of camp following, really, which is why I was born there. So for the first 2 years of my life, my mother and I were kind of camp following in a way. And then we went back to Nyasaland in 1943 when I was 2, and my father was sent back a bit before the end of the war to do, I suppose, rather vital agricultural service.
How was he, how was your relationship with him?
Well, very good. I mean, he's still alive. I learned an awful lot from him. He was a botanist. He read botany at Oxford, knew all the flowers, knew all the Latin names of all the flowers. And my sister and I were not such good naturalists as him. I certainly wasn't. But we learned a lot about plants. And I learned a lot about biology. I think I learned my first understanding of Darwinian evolution from my father.
What about your mother, and what sort of characteristics of her do you carry with you?
She is a very kind person, a very lively, intelligent person. She's also a good botanist. She knows flowers. We had a very well-educated childhood, nothing to do with school. I mean, school was good too, but we had a good home. My sister and I had a good home life where we learned a lot from both our parents.
You said you had a normal Anglican upbringing, according to one piece I read on you, and I was wondering how much religion was debated in your house, how much it was part of the discussion.
My parents were not and are not religious, but I was sent to Anglican schools the way most people in Britain were at that time.
In terms of the importance, though, I mean, was the issue of, evolution, creation, and so on discussed early on in your life?
No, not at all. No.
But apparently, you first doubted doubted the existence of God when you were about 9 years old. What triggered that thought?
I think discussing with my mother the fact that there are lots of different religions, they're all different from each other, they can't all be right, and so why should one assume that the particular one happened to be brought up in was the right one?
I mean, most kids at that age are wondering whether it's Santa Claus or not.
Well, but yeah, I was 9, I think.
Now, in terms of then, as having those sort of views, did you feel it was anything different? I mean, with your peers, if in that sort of time and environment, religion was quite a strong factor in driving people.
Yes, I wasn't seriously non-religious then. I mean, I went back to, I was confirmed in the Church of England at the age of 13, I think. So that was only this realization of comparative religion, if you like, this realization that there are lots of different religions, so they can't all be right. That was a fairly fleeting flicker of doubt, which was overruled by conscientious vicars and people later.
Well, you went on to study zoology at Balliol College in Oxford, and you actually studied under the Nobel laureate, Nicholas Tinbergen. In fact, went on to stay on as a research assistant with him as well, I think, for a few more years in Oxford. Now, what was the most important thing you learned from him?
Gosh, well, he had this wonderful phrase, machinery for survival. He saw animals as machines. He loved animals. I mean, he was a really great world-class naturalist. He loved animals, studied them in the wild, but he did see them as machines in the sense that he was always trying to work out how they worked. And so I think that was at least one of the main lessons that I got from him. Another one was a preoccupation with Darwinian selection, Darwinian survival value of behavior. So he saw animal behavior, each pattern of animal behavior was sort of like a bone or the heart. It was like an organ. It was like something that was shaped. Indeed, it was something that was shaped by natural selection. Just because behavior is movement in time, it was no less subject to being selected by Darwinian selection than an anatomical structure.
Well, of course, a lot of this appeared later in your work, in your best-selling writing. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. More questions with Professor Richard Dawkins in just a moment. Don't go away.